and welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. For the last few years, I've been learning more about how nutritious food is like medicine, the importance of movement and the right exercise, and how simple pleasures like enjoying 20 minutes of natural daylight in the morning can massively improve our sense of well-being and sleep. A physiotherapist and high-performance trainer friend of mine, Pete Marcassiano, described the good quality sleep I'd been missing out on as the elixir of life. Key to working and feeling better. Essential time for our bodies to repair and rejuvenate. So today, I'm excited to be featuring an eminent professor whose life's work has been centered around sleep and our 24-hour biological body clock. Russell Foster is Professor of Circadian Neuroscience at Oxford University and the Director of the St. Jules Thorne Sleep and Circadian Institute. I've been engrossed in his book, Lifetime, a perfect blend of humour, science and pure genius, according to Ruby Wax. And to use Russell's words, a distillation of 4 decades of the excitement, wonder and undiluted pleasure he's experienced in this field. Russell, it's so lovely to meet you. What a lovely line of the excitement, wonder and undiluted pleasure that you've experienced in this field. That really is a lovely thing to say, isn't it?
Well, thank you, Helen. Yes, and it's true. I mean, many of us sort of find it difficult to get out of bed in the morning, but most days spring gazelle-like because I can go into the lab, I can interact with extraordinary colleagues and sort of peel back some of the emerging science in this area. And it's turning out to be so fascinating still after 40 years. I love it.
I would imagine. How on earth did you get Ruby Wax on the back cover, actually, of the book? I've got it in my hand at the minute. We've got Bill Bryson on the front saying a superlative guide to some of the most intriguing questions of human existence. And the author of Breath, James Nestor, saying he learned so much. Gosh, some amazing quotes there.
I know, I was so lucky. And I got to know Bill through sort of sitting on the same committees at the Royal Society. And we just got on so well. And when he wrote his book on the human body, we spent a day chatting about what I was doing and we sort of kind of followed up. We did a lot of emailing actually over lockdown and were sending each other photographs of our garden and flowers and ponds and things like that. And Ruby's an old chum. I've known her for a very long time. And she's remarkable. I got to know her when she did her mindfulness degree in Oxford.
Of course.
And we cackled away a lot. No, she's a lot of fun and has been incredibly supportive.
Wonderful words from her. I just wondered, do you agree with my friend Pete that good sleep is the elixir of life?
I think so. It is absolutely a pillar of health. And it's wonderful now that there's been this turnaround. And we've gone from the 80s where it was sort of almost a badge of honor that if you didn't sleep, people would come and say, I've just done another all-nighter, and I get a slap on the back. Now people are saying, well, actually, I don't want somebody in the work environment who's disinhibited, can't think properly, overly impulsive, lacking in empathy, and doesn't have creativity. And it's finally been recognized. So, those of us who've been banging that drum for a while are sort of thrilled.
I think there were many famous people in life who talked about sleep as a waste of time, really, but sleep is really important, isn't it? Why is it so important, Russell?
I mean, that was what's so fascinating. You say you got Edison. Sleep is a criminal waste of time and a throwback to our cave days. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Why is it so important? Well, first of all, it is absolutely not a time when the brain goes to sleep. It shuts down. In fact, some areas of the brain are more active when we're asleep than when we're awake. And I suppose we can define the importance of sleep because of what happens when we don't get it. And so, for example, if we think about our emotional responses, we have big fluctuations in mood, irritability, anxiety, loss of empathy. I mean, that's so important. You can't pick up those important signals from other people. You don't respond to them appropriately. Risk-taking and impulsivity, doing stupid and unreflective things when you're tired. A really important area, some beautiful data by a German scientist called Jan Born, showed that the tired brain preferentially remembers negative experiences and forgets the positive one. So if you're tired, your whole worldview is dominated by your negative rather than your positive experiences. I think it's so important. And if you think about our cognition, our ability to multitask, we're bombarded with stuff coming in all the time. And what we've got to do is extract the important stuff and act upon it. And it's very difficult to do that. It's very difficult to multitask when you're tired. To concentrate, to process information, to communicate, to make decisions, to be creative, and of course our sense of humor. If you're tired, you lose one of those essential ingredients of being human, which is the ability to laugh. So those are the sort of short-term impacts, and the longer term, as we're sort of seeing in our night shift workers, for example, or the business sector, which is many people experiencing very short sleep. You have microsleeps. You fall asleep uncontrollably. It was a study on junior doctors a few years ago showing that 57% have either had a crash or a near miss on the drive home from doing the night shift. 57% uncontrollably falling asleep at the wheel. Then you have cardiovascular disease, and these are sorts of things that build up over years. So we're talking about 10, 15, 20 years. Altered stress responses, higher rates of cancer. Really very interesting. The World Health Organization has defined night shift work as a probable carcinogen because so many individuals have higher rates of cancer. Classic studies on night shift nurses, higher rates of breast cancer and colorectal cancer. Metabolic abnormalities, type 2 diabetes, much more common in long-term night shift work than day shift work. And really very important, depression and psychosis, much higher rates in those individuals who are chronically sleep deprived. And then finally, dementia. Very recent data has shown that poor sleep in the middle years is a risk factor for dementia later on. Now, I wouldn't say that not getting the sleep that you need is going to cause dementia, but it's certainly a risk factor that we need to start taking seriously. And interestingly, we've got the mechanisms underpinning that. And it was just correlation before, but we now know that one of those proteins that underpins dementia, or is thought to underpin dementia, beta amyloid, that misfolded protein is actually packaged up and cleared whilst we're asleep. And if you don't get the sleep, it's not cleared. And so it can build up. And this has been shown both in animal models, but also in humans. It's really quite remarkable new data.
You said so much in that first answer that I want to unpack. There were so many different things.
Sorry.
No, it was great.
It was a stream of consciousness.
It's absolutely fine. My eyes were lighting up. I mean, we do live in a 24-hour hectic world, a digital age where it's very difficult to switch off. And I think boundaries between work and relaxation are blurred. So are we really living out of sync in some ways with our body clock in a different way to perhaps our grandparents were?
Well, we are. And I think it's fascinating. If you think about the way that we as a species thought about sleep before the Industrial Revolution, and I really mean when the Industrial Revolution was really embedded for most people, which is from the 30s, 40s, 50s onwards. And you think about Shakespeare, the honey heavy dew of slumber. I mean, just such beautiful words, sleep, nature's soft nurse, how have I forsaken thee? We embraced it intuitively. And then because we could invade the night with cheap electric light and safer light, we did. And we basically threw away an essential part of our biology without even thinking about it. We haven't deliberately wanted to damage our lives. We've just done it without thinking about it. It's all about unintended consequences, which is, why so many things do go wrong. You haven't been able to foresee some of the consequences of actions.
But when you do dial it back, everyone laughs at me. I go to bed about 9:30 now, and I wait with the sunshine coming through very early. Yeah. And for the first time in my life, I think I feel rested. So when you do taste that proper deep sleep again, it makes a big difference. I am holding a copy of Lifetime, which is Sunday Times bestseller. It does actually, I do always feel that every book says Sunday Times bestseller on it. And that's not a slight.
Burst my bubble, why don't you?
Oh, sorry, Russell, that sounded really mean. But lots of books do say it, and it's great that you're a Sunday Times bestseller. I'm more impressed by the wonderful quotes you've got. But what I'm even more impressed about is this has been my constant companion for the last week or so. It's a wonderful book. And I just wondered if you'd explain to us what inspired you to write it.
A couple of things. One is that there had been an extraordinary set of discoveries within the whole area of sleep and circadian rhythms, and I wanted to make that available. I'm very passionate about the fact that as scientists, we need to communicate what we do. We're being paid by invariably the general public, and they need to know what's being done in their name. So I'm passionate about public engagement. And I think this is not just sort of an icing on the cake. It's actually part of what we should all be doing. So there was that aspect. The other aspect was I was getting completely fed up with the sergeant majors of sleep screaming, you must get 8 hours of sleep. You can't look at a Kindle before you go to bed. And this is just nonsense. And so I wanted to provide the science, provide the evidence, and then people will be able to make their own decisions about how they might want to improve their sleep or indeed not worry about their sleep. I think there's this incredible sleep anxiety that has arisen. I remember a person coming up to me a few years ago saying, I don't get 8 hours of sleep. am I going to die? And I said, well, yeah, you're going to die, but it may be completely independent of the fact of how much sleep you're getting. Sleep is critically important, as we've discussed, but we need to define for ourselves what sort of sleep each of us needs. And sleep is like shoe size. One size does not fit all. It's a highly dynamic, changeable behavior, so it won't be constant. And so how do we know if we're getting enough sleep? And do we need to think about getting better sleep? And it's kind of advice we get from our grandparents. Are you able to function optimally during the day? Are you firing on all cylinders? If you're not, then your chances are you may not be getting the sleep you need at night. Do you oversleep extensively on free days? Are you dependent upon an alarm clock or somebody else to wake you up? Does it take a long time to wake up? Do you have that sort of sleep inertia? Do you feel groggy? Do you feel sleepy, irritable when you're awake? Do you crave a nap during the day? Do you find yourself doing stupid and unreflective things, those impulsive behaviors? Do you want caffeinated drinks to keep you going? And also, you need to listen to your friends, family, and the people you're spending your life with. Have they reported you're a bit more irritable? You don't seem so empathetic. I don't quite understand where you're coming from. And these are all signs we're not getting the sleep that we need. And you don't need a device to tell you this. This is something that we should take ownership of and work out for ourselves.
And what happens in our brains and in our bodies during that sleep? What are the critical processes in terms of perhaps repair or healing or rejuvenating that we get from proper sleep?
It's all of those things. I mean, essentially, we're burning up stuff during the day. We're producing potentially toxins because they're the side product of metabolism. So we've got to get rid of those. And we've talked about beta amyloid, this misfolded protein, as being a classic example. We've got to realign our metabolism so that we can readjust it, ready for the next day, make sure that the organ systems are all properly coordinated. We've got the reserves we need ready for mobilization the next day. And of course, we've been overwhelmed with information during the day. This is, again, the joy of having this extraordinary structure on the top of our head, this brain, the most complicated structure in the known universe. It's taking in all this information, huge amounts of information, and we can't deal with it online. So essentially, you can think of sleep as being sort of an offline processing of information. So memory consolidation, the processing, the solving of problems. I mean, I think it's so remarkable. There was this sort of study which showed that if a problem-solving task, if you introduced it to people in the morning, so they became familiar with it, and then they were asked to perform the task in the afternoon. It's a complicated task, but about 20% of the group solved the problem. Give it to the second group, introduced in the morning, but they performed it the following afternoon, but they were deprived of sleep. And again, about 20% solved the problem. The really extraordinary data, third group, introduced to the task in the morning, performed it the following afternoon, but with a full night of sleep, 60 to 70% of the group solved the problem.
Wow.
If you want to solve problems, if you come up with novel solutions to complex problems, then a night of sleep can enormously enhance our capability to do that.
What about if people are listening to this in a slight panic like I was when I was told that sleep was the elixir of life and I really wasn't getting it? What can people do if they think, gosh, that's me, I go to bed, that's when I process the worries of the world, and 2 or 3 hours later I'm still tossing and turning and not asleep? Are there things that we can do ourselves, perhaps like I mentioned even in the introduction, taking in some daylight in the morning, which my son always laughs when I tell him that I'm improving my circadian rhythm.
Well, yeah, I mean, children, it's obligatory that they laugh at their parents. I know exactly the feeling. But yes, and I think you raised such an important point, Helen, because many people think, well, sleep is what you get. But it's another dynamic behavior that we have a huge amount of control over. And I think people should really not worry about their sleep. Clearly, it's vitally important, but it's our friend. It's not a sort of an enemy that needs to be bludgeoned into submission. We need to embrace this part of our biology. And in the book, I mean, that was one of the other reasons for writing it. There are a range of suggestions, recommendations, but not orders about how you might want to think about improving your sleep-wake patterns. So, for example, there's a table in the book which divides up what you can do during the day, before bed, the bedroom itself, and the bed. And I won't go through all of it now, but you're right. Let's start with get that morning light, because that's what's so important at setting the circadian clock, the body clock, and therefore the timing of the sleep-wake cycle, so that you're aligned optimally to the demands of the day. Your internal day is aligned to the external day. But during the day, it's so important because most people don't have a sleep problem. They have an anxiety or a stress problem. And so I think what people need to do as a high priority is work out ways in which you can de-stress. You can step back from the pressures of work, family life, and all the rest of it. And I know it's immensely difficult, but there are techniques. So mindfulness. I was extremely rude about mindfulness. In fact, that was one of those early conversations with Ruby Wax, and I sort of had it in the same box as crystal waving. I now apologize unreservedly. Now I've seen the data which shows that for some people, mindfulness can be an incredibly effective way of winding down and relaxing at the end of the day. And I have indulged in it myself, I have to confess. But it may be just reading a few pages of Jane Austen or listening to a Beethoven symphony or whatever you find can take you away from the pressures of life and relax you. And know that, in fact, your sleep processes are probably perfectly intact. It's not letting stress and anxiety overwhelm that fundamental biology. So, stress.
You gave me another phrase, which is now my favorite with my son. Now when I'm having my takeaway coffee in the morning in the sunlight, I tell him I'm taking my photon shower, thanks to you.
Yes.
What's a photon shower?
Well, yes. I sort of came up with the idea because I thought, wouldn't it be great if when you're in the shower in the morning and it was winter, you had a really big light which you could sort of illuminate yourself with, and so you get that morning light. Actually, the photon shower really should be outside. It's just that in the winter months, particularly in the northern and southern hemispheres, away from the equator, we don't get a huge amount of light. And it really is important. I mean, even on a grey old day in the UK, going outside can get you the light that you need to set the clock. But being inside, I mean, it's really fascinating. We live our lives in dim, dark caves. I urge your listeners to go and buy a lux meter, a light meter. They're quite cheap and they're fascinating because it can tell you how much light you're exposed to. And you go outside, even on a grey old day, and you'll be getting 5, 10, 15,000 lux. You take it inside and you go to the middle of a room, then you may be lucky to get 100 lux or 200 lux. And so we are really deprived of the sorts of levels of light that you would encounter in nature.
And then what does that light do? What are the benefits of the light?
Now, this is, of course, we don't have long enough, I don't think, for me to give you a complete answer. But this is the core of what I've been doing for most of my career, which is understanding how the internal biological clock is set to the external world. And light is the critical factor. And if you don't have eyes, then the clock will keep on ticking. But for most of us, it'll get later and later and later in time. And so I have the privilege of working with Blind Veterans UK. And many of those individuals have either sustained very bad damage to their eyes or lost their eyes. They're remarkable individuals. They want to maintain their independence and they're very positive. And I spoke to one chap and he said, I'm not going to be the person in the street or the untidy front garden. So bearing in mind he's completely blind, he found a way of going to the shed, getting out the lawnmower and working out how to cut the lawn in the front of his house. And he was doing this and his wife came down and tapped him on the shoulder and said, it's 3 a.m. in the morning. You're disturbing the neighbors. And it's a really poignant example of somebody determined to make the best of things and not let blindness sort of crush them. And yet, as he put it, I feel my body is trying to fool me all the time. And that's what it's like to be time blind. So the eye gives us our sense of course, space through vision, but it also gives us our sense of time because of its regulation of the internal body clock. Anyway, that's the background. So we started quite a few years ago now trying to understand how the eye grabs this light for the regulation of the clock. And of course, the assumption is, well, it's the visual cells, the rods and cones of the retina. But we were working on mice with hereditary retinal disorders, mice with gene defects, and they were being studied to understand human blindness. They had gene defects whereby the visual cells had broken down, the rods and cones had collapsed. They were visually blind. But when we put them in a running wheel and connected the running wheel, what a pet shop running wheel, to a computer, we saw that when they were exposed to a light-dark cycle, they would coordinate their activity perfectly with a light-dark cycle. And not only could they do it, not only could they align the internal day with the external world, but they did it with unattenuated sensitivities. And if you covered the eyes, then this ability had gone. So we thought, well, this is extraordinary. And so I remember taking these early data to a big vision meeting when I was based in the States and concluding my talk with a great flourish by saying, and of course, these data are entirely consistent with the fact that the eye contains an unrecognized light-sensing cell, an unrecognized photoreceptor. And a chap at the front of the audience stood up, looked at me, and I thought he was going to ask a question. And he looked at me and just said, "Bullshit," and walked out.
Oh, nice.
I mean, and the argument was, and it's quite fascinating because you think of, science as being this extraordinary, open-minded and revolutionary force. And in many ways it is, but it's also incredibly conservative. And essentially, I would face the barrier of, we've been studying the eye for 150 years. Are you seriously telling us we've missed an entire class of light sensing system? And of course, I was young, full of vigor and confidence. I said, yes, and I will show you. And I spent the next 10 years providing the overwhelming amount of evidence. And we now know there is another light sensor within the eye. And it's based upon the cells in the eye, the retina, that form the optic nerve. They're called retinal ganglion cells. And their axons, their projections, leave the eye and go into the brain. Now, 1 out of every 100 of those cells is able to detect light, which is just extraordinary. So we have this dual system in the eye, vision and the regulation of time. And we have separate photoreceptors to do these different sorts of tasks. Now, they do talk to each other, but they're primarily responsible for vision and the regulation of the clock and other brightness detection tasks. What's turned out to be really fascinating is that part of our pupil constriction is dependent upon those non-visual cells within the eye. And we're finding out, in fact, they project to areas of the brain which are related to alertness and mood. So we also think that they are responsible for, as you increase the amount of light, you increase the levels of alertness, and we think it's via those new receptors within the eye. So asking a fundamental, curiosity-driven question, how does the eye regulate the clock? We discovered an entirely new light-sensing system. And where that's going now, and I'm, again, extremely excited about this, and we go right back to those blind veterans, is that we've been following the pathway in. We know that there were weird new receptors, but how do they actually interact with the clock? And we've worked out those pathways, and we now have drugs that will mimic the effects of light on the clock. So what I hope to do to end my scientific career is use those drugs to give back a sense of time to those individuals who've lost their eyes or have had very bad damage to their eyes, give them back a sense of biological time. And it's not just the profoundly blind. We've also been studying severe mental illness such as schizophrenia, neurodevelopmental conditions, and other conditions where the sleep-wake timing systems have fallen apart. And I'm very hopeful that we can use those drugs also in those other individuals where we can give back a sense of time and, of course, get rid of this sleep and circadian rhythm disruption and therefore improve overall cognition, emotions, and well-being. So I think we're at an extremely exciting stage.
You mentioned Alzheimer's earlier, and I know, having worked with the dementia choir and actress Vicky McClure, that a lot of people in the dementia choir struggle with sleep. And in fact, the lady who runs it, her husband, Mick, doesn't really sleep. He's the same age as me, and she stays awake all night because Mick potters around the house. And, obviously she's nervous he might put the gas on and forget. So could what you're studying now help give people with dementia and Alzheimer's their biological clock back potentially?
That is my profound hope. Yeah, and I think we have a really good chance of doing it. We've done one of the drugs. We know it works spectacularly well in mice, and we are very similar to mice in so many ways, except for one thing, which we may want to get to.
Go on.
But it works in mice. We've also done our first studies, and we know it's safe in humans. So now we're trying to develop the funding to get that first proof of principle done to show that we can give back a sense of time to individuals. And it's going to be a very simple experiment. We keep people in very low light, constant light, and we give the drug every day, and we'll see if they align to the drug, thinking that it's light. So that's the first simple experiment. Make sure it works, get the dosing right, and then we'll go into the profoundly blind and then hopefully other clinical populations.
I think sometimes when we talk about circadian rhythm, people always think circadian rhythm is just linked to sleep. But when we're talking about our 24-hour biological clock, is our clock linked to the earth? Is it to the movement of the earth and the sun? Is that how we're geared up to have a biological clock?
You're completely right. If you think about it, and it's so obvious, we don't really think about it. We sit on a planet that revolves once every 24 hours. And of course, that generates the light-dark cycle. These are fundamentally different environments, and all life on Earth has evolved specializations that adapt them to the varied demands of darkness versus light. And in us, of course, it's sleep, during the dark hours and its consciousness during the light hours. And for our biology to work, what it requires is to deliver the right stuff at the right concentration to the right organs and tissues at the right time of day. And so what the circadian system does is provide this organization in time and space, allowing us to do the right thing at the right time, which is utterly synchronized with the varied demands of sitting on a planet that revolves once every 24 hours. That's it in essence. And it's quite fascinating. It's thought that circadian rhythms are a particularly ancient part of life on Earth. And so the argument is that in the early Earth, there was very little oxygen, no ozone layer. And so ultraviolet light, the really damaging rays of ultraviolet B and C, were hitting the Earth, and they would destroy biological molecules, particularly DNA, the coding stuff of life. So if you could confine your DNA activity to the dark rather than the light, then you wouldn't have your DNA smashed up. And so it's thought that circadian rhythms evolved as a way of compartmentalizing in time and the appropriate time of day essential biology. And what we see is that the entire animal lineage, and I mean vertebrates and invertebrates, have built their molecular clocks in almost the same way. I mean, it is quite extraordinary that the Nobel Prize in 2017 given to young Rosbash and Hall was not because of discovering how the clock worked in us, but in the fly. And those fundamental observations in flies translate almost perfectly to humans. I mean, it is quite extraordinary. However, having said that, the way that plants have built their clocks and fungi and certain bacteria do it slightly differently. They've got another set of genes and proteins that can produce their molecular clockwork. And so it looks as though circadian rhythms have evolved several times as life emerged from primeval ooze.
Isn't the clock a little bit longer than 24 hours as well? She says, trying to pluck another little nugget from your book. Do you know, they say little knowledge is dangerous. And that's how I live my life, Russell, because I know a little bit about a lot of things.
But that means you ask the right questions. And that's why it's those questions that arise from some knowledge, which it makes people like me have to think, well, actually, I've never really thought about it quite like that. So these are great questions. And of course, I've now forgotten the question you asked.
Whether our clocks are a little bit longer than 24 hours.
Yes and no. So for humans and other day-active mammals, then the clock is usually a bit longer than 24 hours. And what we mean by that is that if you weren't exposed to a light-dark cycle, if you or I went down to a deep, dark cave, constant light, we would be getting up a bit later and later and later and later each day. Mice are nocturnal animals, and so their clocks, like other nocturnal animals, tend to be a bit shorter. So under constant conditions, they get up a bit earlier and earlier and earlier. Now, why that isn't exactly sure, but it seems to be a rule of thumb. Day-active longer clocks, night-active shorter clocks. It's quite fascinating. And it depends upon how fast the molecular oscillation goes. And I realize at this point, I haven't really explained what the molecular clock is. So you've got this bunch of clock genes sitting in the nucleus of a cell. They produce proteins. Those proteins form a complex, then move into the nucleus and turn their genes off. So no more message, no more protein production. Those proteins are then degraded, and then the genes can then be activated once more. So what you get is a cycle of clock protein production and then degradation. And that oscillation of production and degradation has a period of about 24 hours. As we said, sometimes a bit longer and sometimes a bit shorter. But that's, in essence, what the molecular clock is. And what's also turned out to be fascinating is that subtle changes or polymorphisms in those genes has been associated with morningness and eveningness, one's chronotype. So larks versus owls, there are tiny changes in some of those genes which speed up or slow down the clock. I mean, it's one of the best examples we have in all of biology of how subtle changes in a gene can then be translated through to have a profound effect upon behavior. It's quite remarkable.
And then there's that creature called the student, who you studied students, haven't you, and their patterns?
Yeah, I have. And they are, in fact, I gave a lecture last night to some 16, 17-year-olds, and it was just a joy because all those questions, surfacing about clocks, and we talked about, teenagers. And the fact that teenagers are shifted later in time. And we need to explain how your chronotype comes about. Well, we've talked about genes. So by their contribution to our genes, our parents are still telling us what time to get up and go to bed. But in addition to one's genetics, there are two other important factors. So from about the age of 10, there's a tendency to want to go to bed later and later and later. And that peaks in men at around the age of 21, women around about 19 and a half. And men tend to be later chronotypes, more owl-like than women. And then from those late teens, early 20s, there's a slow move. So by the time you got to your late 50s and early 60s, you're getting up about 2 hours earlier you did when you were in your late teens, early 20s. Now, what's causing it? We think it's the hormones underpinning puberty. So that sharp rise from 10 to the late teens, early 20s is, of course, during the time of puberty, when in women, estrogen, progesterone are really rocketing forward, and in men, testosterone. And then those hormones decline slowly as we age. And that's associated again with the more morningness that we experience later on in life. Now, how do we know it's those hormones? Well, we know there are receptors to those hormones in the master clock, and animal studies have shown a mouse doesn't have a menstrual cycle. It has an estrous cycle, which means it ovulates every 4 days. And as those hormones change, you can actually see the onsets of the mouse running in the running wheel slightly change as those hormone levels change. It's so cool. So it seems to be those changes in those sex hormones that are so important. So we've got genetics, we've got age and changing hormone levels, and then we've got the third thing, which is the thing that we can manipulate. So we talked about the importance of light, but light does different things at different times. So morning light advances the clock, makes you get up earlier and go to bed earlier, whereas dusk light delays the clock, makes you go to bed later and get up later. And we did a study, going back to your original question, Helen, we did a study on university students all over the world. And we were able to show that the later the chronotype, the more owl-like they were, they got less morning light, which would advance the clock, but they were getting late afternoon and evening light, which would delay the clock. So there's a great correlation. So it's not simply genes and age, but it's also when we see light. And that gives us some hope. I mean, people like me who are extreme late types, and if we have to get up early, as I did through many years, I would be very vigorous. I would set the alarm clock. I would get out of bed. I'd get light exposure. That would set the clock. It would make sure I got the morning light, advance the clock, and would make it easier to get up in the morning. So I get problems, of course, when students oversleep at the weekend. They miss the morning light, which means the clock drifts to a later time. So getting up on Monday is more difficult because the clock is slightly delayed. It's more difficult to get up.
There might also be some alcohol involved in it and clubbing as well. I'm guessing
Who
that
knows?
makes it
I
difficult on a Monday
like to comment.
morning.
Although I do find this generation are drinking far less than my generation.
Well,
anyway, that's
I'm not sure. That's a definitely conversation for a cup of tea. Light is an incredible force. It's defined life on Earth, hasn't it? And is the subject of your new book. How is that new book going? And have you got publishers chasing you?
Well, yes, I've got the deadline is the end of this year. I've just completed the first chapter on how sunlight is actually formed in the sun. Classic sort of dinner party conversation. Does anyone know here how sunlight is generated? And they say, oh, well, it's sort of nuclear fusion and a lot of hand waving. But nobody actually knows unless they're a nuclear physicist. So I wanted to get the science right. And of course, I was taught that sunlight is a bit like heating up an iron bar. So, you heat up an iron bar, the atoms in the iron, the electrons move to an outer orbital, then they fall back and they release the energy as red light. That's complete nonsense. The sun doesn't work like that at all. There are no atoms. It's all subatomic particles and electrons and protons and neutrons that are whizzing around. And it's those interactions that generate nuclear fusion, which ultimately give rise to the light that we see. But the first emission is actually gamma radiation. As these particles of energy move further and further outward from the core of the sun, they lose energy and then we form the light that we can actually see. It can take 20 to 200,000 years for a photon to move from the center of the sun to the edge, and then 8 minutes to get to Earth. And then the excitement starts. You've got, so many different sorts of things going on. And the second chapter, which I've now completed, is all about ultraviolet light. and the fact that our stratosphere and ozone absorbs UVC, which is very damaging. We get a bit of UVB and a lot of UVA. And what does that light provide? Well, it's some animals, of course, use UV light to see. We don't. But UVB exposure is essential for vitamin D synthesis. So, so many aspects of our health are related to vitamin D. I jumped ahead to do that chapter. I'm now going to go back and do the easier chapters for me, which will be writing all about vision, what happens during eye damage. Then we can talk about circadian rhythms. We can talk about photosynthesis. But I also want to include the way that different colors, wavelengths of light alter our mood and our appreciation of objects. So that'll blend into art. I'm really quite looking forward to getting into the human aesthetic and talking about Caravaggio and Turner and all that stuff. And then the last chapter will be on architecture and glass. I'm privileged enough to sit on a jury called the Daylight Award jury. And there's a prize for research and there's a prize for architects. And for the architects, it's how they've incorporated natural light into their architectural design. And that's increasingly important. In fact, one famous artist who I happen to know, Ian Ritchie, said, light is the first principle from which all architecture follows. So this is fascinating. It's a huge subject. And will I finish by the end of the year? Well, I hope so. And that's the first draft. And then there'll be a year of refining, editing, and publication is due at the beginning of 2026.
And how have you brought the great masters in?
I've yet to.
How will you? What's the plan?
I hope my publisher isn't listening. The plan is really to think about the way that light has been used. I mean, Caravaggio is a classic example. How does he bring the awareness of an object, usually a person, a beautiful portrait? And what he does is make the background black. And it's the contrast that then, detected by the eye, enhances the visual response. So I'm going to try and bring the art into the context of what we know about vision and how images are formed by the eye. Well, when it's collected by the eye, but it's mainly, of course, the images are being formed within the brain.
And of course, another important chapter that I think you were saying, it was chapter 12 from when we had our pre-chat, is mental health. That will form a part of the book too, won't it?
Well, absolutely. And light, of course, is incredibly important in mental health. And so, for example, some studies a few years ago compared the effects of light therapy, and this was 30 minutes of 10,000 lux. They compared that light treatment with a placebo, an empty tablet as it were, Prozac, and they looked over 8 weeks about the effect of decreasing non-seasonal depression. By 8 weeks, Prozac was significantly different from placebo. So it took 8 weeks for the Prozac to kick in. That's important, actually, because most people, when they put on Prozac, they don't feel better immediately, and they think they will. It can take many weeks. But light, quite extraordinarily, showed a statistical difference between the placebo at 2 weeks, and by 8 weeks was much more effective than Prozac in reducing levels of depression. I think that's remarkable. And one further bit that came from that study was the combining Prozac with light, and the effects were additive, which suggests, of course, that light and Prozac are coming in to deal with depression using different pathways. So do we know the mechanism? No, we really don't know how light is improving mood and depression. There are lots of speculations, but we simply don't know yet. And I think, again, that's a really fascinating area to explore. What the book will do is not only draw attention to the importance of light, but also the stuff we still have yet to discover. And I think this is important for individuals who are thinking of going into science. I think, it's all been done. All the big stuff's done. No, it hasn't. Fundamental stuff has yet to be discovered, and it's the next generation coming through that has so many exciting opportunities to nail those critical questions.
I wish you'd been my science teacher. I think I might have done science. You have a beautiful way of describing things and a lovely way of explaining things in layman's terms, which of course is important to a broad audience. You studied zoology at Bristol University, where my daughter's studying at the minute. How did you end up in this field?
Well, it's completely unexpected because I was a competitive swimmer. I was a good swimmer. I loved doing all that kind of water stuff. And I love biology. And so I thought, right, I'm going to become a marine biologist. It's kind of straightforward. You like being in the water, you like biology. And then I discovered physiology in my second year and thought, wow, here's a way to try and understand mechanisms, the mechanisms underpinning behavior. And so got into my third year project was trying to understand how light is detected by a pineal photoreceptor, third eye structure in tadpoles, which is just amazing. And then my PhD work was trying to work out how birds detect day length, how they detect the increasing day lengths of springtime to trigger their reproductive responses. And of course, what that needs is not only a photoreceptor, but also some sort of timer to sense how long that light or dark is. And so that got me into circadian and clock timing systems. So then spent time in Holland learning photoreceptor biochemistry and anatomy, then went to the States, the University of Virginia for 8 years, and then became part of the National Science Foundation Center for Biological Timing. And that's where I really became a clocky. And my niche was how are clocks regulated by light? And nobody was really interested in that. They thought, well, it's got to be the eye, it's got to be vision. And of course, they didn't know anything about those new photoreceptors. So that was sort of the mechanistic stuff. But the work in mental health was, again, of a serendipitous thing. I was in a lift with a psychiatrist in a hospital in London. And he said, oh, you work on sleep and clocks and stuff. And I said, yeah, I do. And he said, oh, well, my patients, they have terrible sleep. And that's because they don't have a job. So they go to bed late, get up late, miss my clinic and don't have friends. And I was really incensed. And so I then worked with another psychiatrist called Eileen Joyce. And we studied her patients with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And we measured empirically their rest-wake patterns using a little device that, we put on the wrist. And it is one of those most extraordinary things in your career, because when we got the data back, these rhythms weren't just bad, they were smashed, completely smashed. And really, it was that casual conversation in a lift with a psychiatrist that asked the question, well, it can't just because they don't have a job. And in fact, that led us in some really fascinating biology and a much better understanding of the relationship between circadian rhythm disruption and mental illness, and what we can do about it. And that's what's also exciting. It's come up with some new treatments to think about stabilization of sleep and circadian rhythms to improve the severity of psychiatric symptoms.
I heard you saying at a speech that you hoped that when your career ends, your legacy will be to give back biological time to certain groups. And I would imagine it's those sorts of groups that you're talking about. You also mentioned sitting by a wildlife pond in that same sentence. So are you planning to sit by a wildlife pond once you've given biological time back?
It's funny you should mention that. For a significant birthday, my wonderful wife, Lizzie, said, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to celebrate this signiort birthday? Notice I'm not telling you which one.
You don't look a day over 40, to be honest.
Yes, thanks so much. And I said, do you know, and I'd sort of experienced a bunch of these, and I didn't really want a big party. And there was one party I went to, and spontaneously a microphone was handed around, and people had to say nice things. I would cringe. It would be toe-curlingly awful to inflict that on my friends and family. So I said, what I'd really like is a wildlife pond. And I've always wanted one of these for decades. And so instead of a party, we built a wildlife pond. Chap came in, and it's a constant source of joy. In fact, I'm going to be looking later on for frog spawn in the pond. We've got dragonflies. It's become from nothing a wildlife little sanctuary. And you can get so much undiluted pleasure from just sitting down there, watching the life emerge. And the water lilies. I mean, I have a competition with my brother-in-law whose pond can get the best and biggest water lilies. I mean, chaps have always got to compete about something, and we compete about water lilies. So, no, that's also been an incredible joy. And it's actually a place you can, well, first of all, it's rather nice on a spring evening to have a G&T down there, but also you can think about stuff. And I think we don't have enough time to think. We are rushing as fast as we possibly can to squeeze more and more into an overpacked day. And we do need to step back and just think about things that are important.
We really do. I'm going to end our chat, as you know, by asking Russell, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken? I don't know whether that'll be linked to water lilies or not, but no. I'm guessing not.
This is interesting. And my first response is, well, as a scientist, I dissect the situation and I try and minimize risk. And then I thought about when I was young. And I did some really dangerous things. I remember one when I was sort of 9 or so to Saturday morning pictures, which was what kids tended to do. And I had to cross a major road And I used to dread going to the pictures every Saturday morning because I was frightened of crossing this road because I couldn't see properly and I couldn't do the green cross code stuff as we've been taught at school to do it. And I remember thinking, well, it's stupid to be so anxious about crossing the road. So I just ran across the road without looking.
I hope your mum didn't know.
No, but it was characteristic of some weird stuff as a kid. I mean, I remember I had one of these childhood microscopes and I used to look down this microscope and it was so frustrating because one's eyelashes got in front of the way. So I just chopped the eyelashes off of one eye and I could see down the microscope, my little microscope, which I loved. And my mum looked at me with horror and said, what have you done? And I said, oh, well, I just got my eyelashes off because, I couldn't see down the microscope properly. And with hindsight, she was brilliant because she didn't lose her temper. She said, well, I don't think that was wise because we have eyelashes for a very good reason, which is to stop dirt and things getting in our eyes. And I really wouldn't do that sort of thing again. And I thought that was a fantastic response. With hindsight, I didn't realize it at the time. For somebody doing a stupid and unreflective thing. Lizzie and I were talking about this sort of thing. And there's nothing I would change in my life. I've been immensely lucky and I've done the things that I've broadly wanted to do. The biggest risk was actually when I'm lucky to be here. And I do remember as I ran across the road, a car horn beeping. So I must have come close to being splattered all over the road.
Oh, wow.
I didn't do it again. I did learn from that. But it's fascinating how children behave. And you don't always process the information properly.
No, until you sit by your wildlife pond and reflect on it because you've been asked to by a journalist doing a podcast. I've realised the only question we've left unanswered probably in the universe on our whole podcast is how we're different to mice, because you teased me with that.
Oh, yes.
And you didn't tell me the answer.
Well, this is important because mice are nocturnal and we are diurnal. So a lot of, and quite rightly, drug testing is done on mice. So what the researcher will do is come in the morning and test the drug on a mouse. Now, the morning is when the mouse is asleep. Our morning is when we're awake. And so, as we've talked, our physiology is completely dynamic. It does different things at different times. And so what people have done is extrapolate from mice when they've given them a drug at one part of their biological day and related it to another part of our biological day. And some very important studies were undertaken on a drug which would reduce the effects of stroke. And so this drug was given to mice who had had a surgical stroke, and they were given it to them in the morning, and it improved the stroke out incredibly. This drug worked very well in mice. They then took it to humans, gave the drug in the morning, and it had no effect at all. And then they thought, well, hang on, this is the beginning of the active phase of a human, not the sleep phase of a mouse. So they went back, gave it to the active phase of a mouse, didn't work at all. Went back to humans and gave it the beginning of their sleep phase, and it's working. So yes, absolutely, I feel we need to use animal models for the clinical testing of drugs, but we've got to do it at the right time. And it raises the question, have we lost really important drugs? And they're now sitting on dusty shelves all over the world because they were tested at the wrong time of day. Whereas if we tested them another time of day, they might turn out to be incredibly effective. And it's another illustration of what you do when really matters. And that sort of applies to all of our biology. And of course, when we're using the biology of another organism to try and explain what's going on in us.
Gosh, you've given us so much to think about. And I think what you've done a fabulous job of is sharing your wonder and undiluted pleasure for the subject on the podcast. I've really enjoyed our conversation and you just spring to life with it all, Russell. It's so lovely to see somebody so passionate about their work. So it's been a pleasure to meet you.
Well, thank you, Helen. It's been an absolute joy and I can't wait until we get together for that cup of tea.
We'll have that cup of tea. Don't tell your publisher because you're probably supposed to be writing chapter 12 right now.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
You've been listening to Professor Russell Foster talking about the science of our biological clock and how getting into a better rhythm can revolutionise our sleep and health. And if you want a fascinating read, then I would highly recommend Russell's book, Lifetime, which is available, I'm sure, in all good bookshops and everywhere else. Download our podcast at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple and Google Podcasts or wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week, hopefully after another good 7 nights of restful sleep. So see you then.